All right, guys, wanted to talk about part two of the CGL. And this is really interesting how the book has decided to divide this up because part two is mostly about how the limits are applied. And then they dump in a whole lot of additional things like conditions and exclusions at the end that seem like much smaller topics than what they were for CGL part one, for example. So part two is really about the limits. And we're going to have a chance to go through some problems here. And those are going to be important because that's how we're going to be able to make sure that everybody understands that on the exam is to have a problem that you have to work through applying different limits. Because the way we have limits here in the CGL is kind of unique. And I don't think it's obvious, at least not on its face. So, all right, let's go ahead and dive into part two. What does the book talk about with CGL part two? The first thing they talk about is who's insured. And this is actually a pretty broad group with one key exception. It's got to be liability that arises from business exposures. So you're going to find out, that the named insured and the relatives are all covered for any business exposures, not personal exposures. So we talk about relatives of partners and anybody who's a controlling member in an LLC. Their relatives actually have liability coverage from the CGL, which seems like a stretch. Except that we're limiting it back to commercial activity by saying this is only for business exposures. All of the employees of the entity have coverage from the CGL, again, only for business exposures. And then if there are other organizations that we're involved with, they'll be covered as well under our CGL, again, as long as it's business exposures from my entity. So it's actually pretty broad. The big restriction is that it's only for business exposures, and that's what you want to focus on there. Then we get right into the limits, which is probably the most difficult thing to understand because this isn't intuitive, at least not to me, it's not. So for every occurrence, we have a limit. Well, let me back up. So when we talked about liability in the homeowner's policy, when you took 270, liability there was very broad, and it was the only limit you had was a per occurrence limit. And so what that meant is if you got sued 4 or 5 or 6 different times for the maximum amount, the policy would pay out the maximum amount 4 or 5 or 6 different times. Because that's so unusual, they can make that promise. The average person isn't getting sued very often for homeowners liability. And if they are, it's certainly not more than once per policy period. That's extremely rare. So they just had an occurrence limit, and that was it. Every time something happens, you get sued. In the homeowner's policy, it was a standard flat $100,000. The companies that write their own homeowners policies, today it's probably more common to see $300,000. But point being, that's the amount, and you have that available every time you get sued. We have that in commercial insurance. The limits are probably going to be higher. You get to choose the limits. There's going to be an each occurrence limit, and that will apply as many times as you need it to, except that there will be a general aggregate limit for the policy period. And that means that, we might have an each occurrence limit. The examples we're going to use have each occurrence limits of $1 million. And then the general aggregate limit is going to be $2 million. And so every time you have a claim, we're subtracting off to make sure that we know how much is still available. And that's going to be for the policy period. Usually that's a year in commercial insurance. So we'll have, each occurrence, this is the most we're going to pay is $1 million. We're not paying more than $1 million for anything. And then over the course of the year, that we're not paying more than $2 million in total. And so you can start to see, all right, well, you could write a whole bunch of problems there that get at the limits. Do you understand how that works? Coverage B usually has a sublimit. Remember, coverage B is the personal and advertising injury. And then we'll also have a coverage C sublimit, and this is going to be a lot lower because remember, coverage C is medical expenses that are paid to other people without having to prove liability. So these are going to be small dollar amounts, relatively speaking. It's not going to be $1 million. It's going to be 5,000, I think, is the number that we're looking at. Now that one's a little bit different. Coverage C limits are per person. So it's not $5,000 in medical payments per occurrence in total. The $1 million each occurrence limit still applies. It's $5,000 per person for medical payments, the way we're going to do it here. You can change those numbers to adapt to your business, what you think you need. I'm just giving you the numbers that we're going to use in the examples. And then 9.8, that refers to a specific example that I have. You don't have this. In class, I'll put it up on a document camera and we'll go through it. Here, I just typed it up in a Word document and we will go through it. And in fact, it probably makes sense to go ahead and do that right now. Let me get that set up. Okay, so here's a pretty good introduction to how we're going to do the limits. All right, let's show what's going on here. We have a general aggregate of 2 million. Here's what's really difficult to understand about the CGL policy. We have a separate limit for products and completed operations, right? Remember, we got those 4 categories of liability. We had premises, operations, product liability, and completed operations, right? Well, products and completed operations, we handle those claims separately out of a separate limit. And when the general aggregate goes down, this products completed operations does not go down unless it's products and completed operations. So you can exhaust your general aggregate and still have the products and completed operations aggregate available. So these are 2 separate limits. And I think that's really hard to understand. This example fortunately gets at some of that. Here's the each occurrence limit, 1 million. Here's the coverage B sublimit, also 1 million. And then we have a separate limit for damage to premises rented to you. We didn't talk about that in the slide, but every example that the industry materials come out with has this as a separate limit. If your business doesn't rent premises, then this limit doesn't matter. The idea is if you're renting premises from somebody, it's really supposed to be their obligation to protect the property from damage. They're going to make you pay for it one way or the other through the cost of the rent. Some leases require that you get the insurance. Be careful if you do, because it's standard for there to be a small or a smaller coverage for damage to premises rented to you. And in this case, we're going to say it's 100,000. Then coverage C limits, sublimits 5,000. Again, that's per person. That's not a total limit per occurrence. All right, so we're going to go through a hypothetical year and we're going to have 4 different occurrences. And I want to show you how this works. So the first one. All right, let's say the contract at the beginning of the year, so 1/1, January 1st, we have the contract start. Then on February 1st, there's a fire in a building that was rented to this corporation, and it caused the following injuries. And you always have to say, well, we're not paying anything. The insurance company is not paying anything outside of coverage C unless the corporation is found liable. So that's why we have to have this sentence in here that says, this piece of the sentence that says, for which Attlee was held liable. Okay, damage to the rented building. That's one of the losses. Then we had medical payments to 10 injured customers, $1,000 each. And then we have bodily injury to others in the amount of $300,000. So, all right, this first one, fire damage to the rented building. Well, we have a sublimit up here. Damage to premises rented to you, the most we're paying is $100,000 here. So for that loss, if they're liable, Attlee will receive $100,000. Second loss, medical payments to 10 injured customers. Well, it's a total of $10,000, but the limit is $5,000. The limit is per person, right? So that means that medical payments to 10 injured customers, if it's $1,000 each, yeah, they'll pay $10,000 out under coverage C. That's considered 10 different payments. This $5,000 limit is per person. Last one, bodily injury to others, $300,000. And this is a fire in a building rented to Attlee. Well, that's going to be under the general aggregate. And so we'll pay out $300,000 there. And if you add all that up, I get $410,000. And then I think you have to do this to keep yourself focused. So how much is left to withdraw upon for the rest of the year? Well, it's the general aggregate minus what we're paying out. So we've got 2 million here minus 410,000. That's going to be looks like 1,590,000 is what's left. Okay, great. That's the first occurrence. We can go on to the second one. Second occurrence on July 10th. So we made it from February to July, no additional claims. July 10th, an elevator mishap in the building caused bodily injury to 15 customers for a total of $1.5 million in damages. And they're held liable for that whole $1.5 million. Okay, well, what we're getting at here, this is a general aggregate claim. So that's not a problem. We have barely a $1.5 million left. We got a little bit more than left to pay, but each occurrence limit is $1 million. And that limit is going to come into play into occurrence 2 here. So the amount here that's going to be paid is only $1 million because that's the each occurrence limit. And so what do they have left to pay? Well, on the aggregate, they had 1,590, and now they've paid out $1 million of that. And that means we've got 590,000 left for the rest of the year in our general aggregate limit. Okay, so that one's not too hard. The key is you had to realize that this is over the each occurrence limit. Third occurrence, November 27th, advertising injury. They improperly used somebody else's picture. The person made a claim. They were held liable. So we've already gone through, the interesting part to me is, well, all right, what are the arguments on either side? And are you going to be held liable or not? We don't get to do any of that. Judges and juries do all that. I really like the law side. I think that's fascinating. And I've done a bunch of research papers on the legal side. None of that matters. We're just saying, yeah, they were held liable for $800,000. And that's good because that's a problem we can solve. The other stuff is all argument. And in the end, it depends on what a judge or a jury is going to think of those arguments. So, all right, advertising injury. What limit are we, what part of the policy are we looking at? Yeah, this is coverage B, right? Personal and advertising injury limits. Personal injury and advertising limits. So up here, let's remind ourselves, personal and advertising injury, we have $1 million in coverage. So that's good. But out of the general aggregate, we only have 590,000 left. That's not enough to satisfy this 800,000 in damages. So they'll pay 590,000, but the aggregate limit is exhausted. So that's nothing left. So there's nothing remaining out of the general aggregate limit. What we're going to find out is, remember, the general aggregate limit is different from the products and completed operations limit. That's a separate limit that's also available, and that's what's going to happen here for this one. So occurrence 4, December 8th, a defective product caused an injury. Adley was held liable for $900,000. So the amount that's paid, $900,000 is going to be paid. This is from this limit up here. Let me go back. This is from the products and completed operations aggregate because this is a product liability. This is a separate limit that is separately available that you have to track separately. So this is from products and completed operations liability. So how much is left here? Well, we'd have 1,100,000. And again, this is from the products and completed operations limit. General aggregate was already exhausted. And that's worth reminding ourselves here. So this is one of the industry problems that they came up with to test if you understand how the limits can be applied. It's not, once you get through the reasons why these are the way they are, it's not terribly difficult, but it is something that I think on first glance you can't look at and understand. Where are the tricky parts? In my mind, the tricky parts are medical expenses or per person. That's tricky. The hardest part is general aggregate and products completed operations aggregate are two separate limits that are tracked separately. And there's nothing from the declarations page that tells you that. Each occurrence, they're not paying more than $1 million no matter what happens for any one incident or related series of incidents that's judged to be one occurrence. And then damage to premises rented to you, well, you just got to keep in mind when you're told what damage it is that it's something that comes from property that you rent. If it does, then there's probably a sublimit that's even smaller there. Okay, that's a good problem. And that is something that's hit pretty heavily on the exam. So it's worth taking some time to make sure you understand how each of these will ultimately play out. Let me just see from my notes here if I had anything else I wanted to talk about. Oh, yeah, well, this is worth talking about. So this occurrence 4, defective product. What if it was a customer that came into the store, slipped and fell, cracked their head open, major medical injury caused by premises liability? Well, if that's the case, remember your general aggregate was already exhausted. So if that's what would have happened, there wouldn't have been anything paid by the insurance company here. Atlee Corporation would have to pay that on their own. But because it's products and completed operations liability, it's a separate limit, separately available. So when you start to think, well, what's the absolute most that could be paid out? Well, it's the sum of these two, plus the damages rented to premises rented to you times however many times you think that could happen, plus 5,000 times however many times you think that could happen. So there's not a firm number in terms of what is the most that could be paid out. It's going to be in the neighborhood here of this 4 million. Well, I'm sorry, there will be an absolute limit of the 4 million because one way or the other, you're going to exhaust one or both of those limits, no matter how you design the problem. So that's the most you could get to. Okay, hopefully that all makes sense. If not, send me an email and I'll try to clarify. It's one of the challenges of trying to do this the way we are without the presence of folks to try to help me. Usually when I'm explaining this, people can ask questions and we can go in and talk about these things right away. There, that'll work good. Let me get this out of the way. But I can't see you. I don't know if this is all making sense. So I'm really relying on communication back to me if it doesn't, and I'm happy to clarify when we can. All right, a couple things that show up. So that's this example that I'm calling 9.8. That doesn't refer to anything you have. So that's why I typed it up so we could all be looking at the same thing. Claims are paid in the order of presentation. So this is important to know. If you injure a whole bunch of people, not for the corporation, but as a person who could be injured, if insurance is involved, they will pay until they reach their limit based on the claims coming in. So in other words, if you've got the biggest claim, they're not going to wait to pay people and pay yours first. They pay it as it comes in, and when they hit the limit, that's it. So that in reality, that creates a little bit of an incentive that most people don't really think about. If you have a claim against a company, if other people are involved, it is to your advantage to get your claim in first to maximize the chance that you're going to get paid. If we know there's going to be a whole lot of people coming in and making a claims, and we know that the limit is not going to be enough, then sometimes people will proactively get involved in trying to figure out, well, how much of the available insurance is going to each party. And we can usually do that on a pro rata basis. More often, we don't know. I know that there were other people. I don't know anything about their claims unless we're consolidating it all together and filing a class action. It's going to be hard to know. So my incentive as the injured person is get my claim in first to make sure that I get paid because their limit runs out when it runs out. You saw how that worked. And if you have a lot of people who are injured with big dollar claims, it's very likely that if you delay on getting your claim submitted, you may not get paid by insurance. If the corporation still has assets, you'll still get paid. But that's a risk that you take. The other thing that happens, even if it looks like we're going to be paying out our limit as the insurance company, we can't just walk away and give the money and say, here you are. We've got a $2 million limit. That's the most we're paying. Here's the money. Go handle it yourself. You have to defend yourself. The defense is still part of it. Now, one thing that does happen is if you exhaust the limits, once the limits are completely exhausted and we're already down to zero, then that means any future losses, the insurance company doesn't have to defend you against either because we already know that their limit is zero. So they have to defend up until the limits are exhausted, even if they know ahead of time that those limits will be exhausted by the claim. That's what I'm trying to say here for the limits of insurance. Okay, we have a whole bunch of conditions to talk about, and I guess it makes sense to probably break it off now and pick up with a new lecture on this one. So we'll do that. Hope that problem made sense. If you need any help with it, please send me an email, and I'll do my best to clarify for you. Thanks a lot.